Samuel Taylor Coleridge. In the prelude, Wordsworth, recording his gratitude to the mountains, lakes, and winds that dwell among the hills where I was born, commiserates with Coleridge because thou, my friend, wert reared in the great city, mid far other scenes. Samuel Taylor Coleridge had in fact been born in the small town of Ottery St. Mary in rural Devonshire, but on the death of his father, he had been sent to school at Christ's Hospital in London. He was a dreamy, enthusiastic, and extraordinarily precocious schoolboy. Charles Lamb, his schoolmate and lifelong friend, in his essay on Christ's Hospital, has given us a vivid sketch of Coleridge's loneliness, his learning, and his eloquence. When in 1791 Coleridge entered Jesus College, Cambridge, he was an accomplished scholar, but he found little intellectual stimulation at the university, fell into idleness, dissoluteness, and debt, then in despair fled to London and enlisted in the Light Dragoons under the alias of Silas Tomkin Cumberbatch, one of the most inept cavalrymen in the long history of the British Army. Although rescued by his brothers and sent back to Cambridge, he left in 1794 without a degree. In June 1794, Coleridge met Robert Southey, then a student at Oxford who, like himself, had poetic aspirations, was a radical in religion and politics, and sympathized with the Republican experiment in France. Together the two young men planned to establish an ideal democratic community in America, for which Coleridge coined the name Pentocracy, signifying an equal rule by all. A plausible American real estate agent persuaded them that the ideal location would be on the banks of the Susquehanna in Pennsylvania. 12 men undertook to go, and because perpetuation of the scheme required offspring, hence wives, Coleridge dutifully became engaged to Sarah Fricker, conveniently at hand as the sister of Southey's fiancée. The Pentocracy scheme collapsed, but at Southey's insistence, Coleridge went through with the marriage, resolved, as he said, but wretched. Later, Coleridge's radicalism waned, and he became a conservative in politics, a highly philosophical one, and a staunch Anglican in religion. In 1795, Coleridge met Wordsworth and at once judged him to be the best poet of the age. When in 1797, Wordsworth brought his sister Dorothy to settle at Alfoxden, only 3 miles from the Coleridges at Nether Stowey, the period of intimate communication and poetic collaboration began that was the golden time of Coleridge's life. An annual allowance of £150, granted to Coleridge by Thomas and Josiah Wedgwood, sons of the founder of the famous pottery firm, came just in time to deflect him from assuming a post as a Unitarian minister. After their joint publication of lyrical ballads in 1798, Coleridge and the Wordsworths spent a winter in Germany, where Coleridge attended the University of Göttingen and began a lifelong study of German philosophers and critics, Kant, Schiller, Schelling, and Fichte, that helped alter profoundly his thinking about philosophy, religion, and aesthetics. Back in England, Coleridge in 1800 followed the Wordsworths to the Lake District, settling at Greta Hall, Keswick. He had become gradually disaffected from his wife, and now he fell helplessly and hopelessly in love with Sarah Hutchinson, whose sister, Mary, Wordsworth married in 1802. In accord with the medical prescription of that time, Coleridge had been taking laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, to ease the painful physical ailments from which he had suffered from an early age. In 1800 to 1801, heavy dosages during attacks of rheumatism made opium unnecessary to him, and Coleridge soon recognized that the drug was a greater evil than the diseases it did not cure. Dejection, an Ode, published in 1802, was Coleridge's despairing farewell to health, happiness, and poetic creativity. A 2-year sojourn on the Mediterranean isle of Malta, intended to restore his health, instead completed his decline. When he returned to England in the late summer of 1806, he was a broken man, a drug addict, estranged from his wife, suffering from agonies of remorse, and subject to terrifying nightmares of guilt and despair from which his own shrieks awakened him. By 1810, when he and Wordsworth quarreled bitterly, it must have seemed that he could not fall any lower. Under these conditions, Coleridge's literary efforts, however sporadic and fragmentary, were little short of heroic. In 1808, he debuted as a speaker at one of the new lecturing institutions that sprang up in British cities in the early 19th century, early 1800s. His lectures on poetry, like his later series on Shakespeare, became part of the social calendar for fashionable Londoners. Women, excluded still from universities, particularly. He wrote for newspapers and single-handedly undertook to write, publish, and distribute a periodical, The Friend, which lasted for some 10 months, beginning in June 1809. A tragedy, Remorse, had in 1813 a successful run of 20 performances at the Drury Lane Theatre. In 1816, he took up residence at Highgate, a northern suburb of London, under the supervision of the excellent and endlessly forbearing physician James Gilman, who managed to control, although not to eliminate, Coleridge's consumption of opium. The next 3 years were Coleridge's most sustained period of literary activity. While continuing to lecture and to write for the newspapers on a variety of subjects, he published Biographia Literaria, Zapolya, a drama, a book consisting of the essays in The Friend, revised and greatly enlarged, 2 collections of poems, and several important treatises on philosophical and religious subjects. In these treatises and those that followed over the next 15 years, he emerged as the heir to the conservatism of Edmund Burke, an opponent to secularism and a defender of the Anglican Church, and an unapologetic intellectual elitist with an ambitious account of the role elites might play in modern states, outlined in his discussions of national culture, and of the clerisy, who would take responsibility for preserving it. The remaining years of his life, which he spent with Dr. and Mrs. Gilman, were quieter and happier than any he had known since the turn of the century. He came to a peaceful understanding with his wife, and was reconciled with Wordsworth, with whom he toured to Rhineland in 1828. His rooms at Highgate became a center for friends, for the London literati, and for a steady stream of pilgrims from England and America. They came to hear one of the wonders of the age, the sage of Highgate's conversation, or monologue, for even in his decline, Coleridge's talk never lost the almost hypnotic power that Hazlitt has immortalized in My First Acquaintance with Poets. Mary Shelley appears to have been haunted by the memory of the evening when, a small child, she hid behind a sofa to listen to Coleridge, one of her father's visitors, recite the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, and a stanza from that poem of dark mystery found its way into Frankenstein, just as her recollections of that visitor's voice contributed to her depictions of the irresistible hold her novel storytellers have over their auditors. When he died, Coleridge left his friends with the sense that an incomparable intellect had vanished from the world. Coleridge's friends, however, abetted by his own merciless self-judgments, sent current the opinion, still common, that he was great in promise but not in performance. Even in his buoyant youth, he described his own character as indolence capable of energies, and it is true that while his mind was incessantly active and fertile, he lacked application and staying power. He also manifested early in life a profound sense of guilt and a need for public expiation. After drug addiction sapped his strength and will, he often adapted, or simply adopted, passages from other writers with little or no acknowledgement, and sometimes in a context that seems designed to reveal that he relies on sources that he does not credit. Whatever the tangled motives for his procedure, Coleridge has repeatedly been charged with gross plagiarism, from his day to ours. After The Ancient Mariner, most of the poems he completed were written, like the first version of Dejection and Ode, in a spasm of intense effort. Writings that required sustained planning and application were either left unfinished or, like Biographia Literaria, made up of brilliant sections padded out with filler, sometimes lifted from other writers, in a desperate effort to meet a deadline. Many of his speculations Coleridge merely confided to his notebooks and the ears of his friends, incorporated in letters, and poured out in the margins of his own and other people's books. Even so, it is only when measured against his own potentialities that Coleridge's achievements appear limited. In an 1838 essay, the philosopher John Stuart Mill hailed the recently deceased Coleridge as one of the two great seminal minds of England. According to Mill, Coleridge's conservatism had, along with the very different utilitarian philosophy of Jeremy Bentham, the other seminal mind identified in Mill's essay, revolutionized the political thought of the day. Coleridge was also one of the important and influential literary theorists of the 19th century, 1800s. One of his major legacies is the notion that culture, the nation's artistic and spiritual heritage, represents a force with the power to combat the fragmentation of a modern, market-driven society and to restore a common, collective life. This was an idea that he worked out largely in opposition to Bentham's utilitarianism, the newly prestigious discipline of political economy, and the impoverished, soulless account of human nature that these systems of thought offered. And in Biographia Literaria and elsewhere, Coleridge raised the stakes for literary criticism, making it into a kind of writing that could address the most difficult and abstract questions about, for instance, the relations between literary language and ordinary language, or between poetry and philosophy, or between perception and imagination. Above all, Coleridge's writings in verse, whether we consider the poetry of Gothic demonism in Christabel, or the meditative conversation poems like Frost at Midnight, or This Lime Tree Bower My Prison, are the achievements of a remarkably innovative poet.